In the middle of a mid-sized city nestled between wide stretches of farmland and the quiet reach of an old river, there stood a building of glass and steel. Not tall enough to scrape the sky, not old enough to carry history in its bones. Just another modern shell of productivity with cubicles, fluorescent lighting, and coffee that never quite tasted right. Inside that building, on the third floor, sat a woman whose presence most barely registered. Her name was Mariah. She arrived at work every morning just before 8. Not a minute early, not a minute late. Her steps were soft, not rushed but purposeful. Mariah didn't carry the kind of energy that turned heads. No bright lipstick, no loud laughs, no tap-tap of heels echoing down the hallway. Just a quiet shuffle, the rustle of her sensible coat, and sometimes the faint scent of lavender she dabbed on her wrists out of habit more than anything else. She worked in operations, logistics mostly, process optimization, supplier coordination, internal audits, the kind of tasks that lived in spreadsheets and systems no one wanted to talk about at meetings but everyone relied on behind the scenes. Mariah didn't mind. She liked numbers. They made sense. They didn't interrupt, didn't compete for attention, didn't forget her name. Her desk sat near the corner, not quite a window seat but close enough that she could catch glimpses of trees swaying outside on windy days. Sometimes, when the building was unusually still, she would pause typing just to listen to the wind against the glass. It reminded her of growing up on the edge of the prairie, where the wind never needed permission to speak and silence wasn't something people feared. Mariah's world was structured. At 10:15, she had her tea, always chamomile. At 12:05, she ate lunch, usually something homemade. Lentils, brown rice, steamed vegetables packed in neat containers. She read while she ate, always a book tucked in her bag. Fiction mostly. Quiet. Stories. Stories where people weren't superheroes, but still found ways to survive. To grow. To heal. No one at the office really knew Mariah. They knew of her, of course. She'd been there almost 10 years. Long enough to have outlasted 5 department heads and 2 office remodels. But most people referred to her in general terms. The quiet one, logistics. What's her name with the cardigans? There was nothing striking about her appearance. Medium height, brown hair pulled back in a bun, soft voice. She listened more than she spoke. Nodded politely in meetings. Took notes that no one else did. She didn't linger at happy hours, never joined in birthday cupcakes unless directly offered one, and rarely spoke up unless something needed correcting in a report. Even then, she did it so gently that people barely noticed she had spoken. But those who did notice, Janet from payroll, the janitor who worked nights, the new intern who once forgot her badge, felt something settle around Mariah. Something calm like still water. They couldn't quite name it, but in her presence, the noise of the world seemed to dim just a little. At home, her life was just as quiet. A small apartment on the 4th floor of an aging brick building where the floorboards creaked and the radiators knocked during winter. Her neighbors hardly ever saw her, though sometimes, in the evenings, soft piano music drifted through the walls. Not played live, but from a record player that had belonged to her mother. Chopin mostly. Debussy. Satie. Gentle things. Mariah would sit by the window with a blanket over her knees, mug of warm milk cooling on the sill, and listen. She didn't need much. She kept a plant by the window, a pothose vine she'd had since college. It had grown long over the years, curling gently around the window frame like it was looking for something. She watered it every Thursday and sometimes talked to it when the evenings felt too quiet. In her bedroom, there were only a few framed photos. Her parents, long gone now, a dog she once had curled up in a blanket, and one of her as a child holding a kite with both hands, grinning into the wind. Her face in that photo was so open, so bright. Sometimes she stared at it and wondered where that girl went. Mariah wasn't unhappy. That's not the right word. But there was a kind of loneliness that settled into her life the way dust does. Slowly, quietly, unnoticed until the light hits it just right. She carried herself with care, like someone who had learned, over many years, not to take up too much space, not to ask for too much. She was the type of person who apologized when someone else bumped into her, who held doors open a second longer just in case someone was behind, who remembered everyone's birthday but never mentioned her own. Still, there was something about her, a steadiness, a presence that wasn't easy to name but hard to forget if you ever really saw her. Most people didn't. But the thing about people like Mariah is this: the world may overlook them for years, dismiss them, underestimate them, but when everything starts to fall apart, it's often their quiet hands, holding the seams together, long before anyone realizes they're the only thing keeping it all from unraveling. And in that office building with its flickering lights and fragile systems, something was beginning to unravel, not in a loud way, not all at once, but like a hairline crack creeping through glass. Unseen but growing. Mariah felt it, long before anyone else did. She always did. It started with an email, one of those vaguely worded all-hands announcements sent from the new director, Neil, someone Mariah had only met once and briefly at that. The subject line read, "Upcoming restructuring, department realignments." Mariah read it 3 times before clicking away. Not because she didn't understand it, but because something in her stomach tightened, an old instinct. She'd seen that kind of language before. Neutral on the surface, unsettling underneath. Words like realignments didn't mean change, they meant casualties. The next week, the buzz around the office grew louder. Whispered conversations in break rooms, side eyes exchanged across desks, sudden meetings in glass rooms with blinds drawn. People speculated, but no one asked Mariah. She watched it all quietly, her eyes scanning. Every new report, every deviation in shipment logs, every delay that hadn't been logged a month ago but now seemed to be popping up everywhere. Then the layoffs began. 2 from accounting, 1 from procurement, the intern from sales, who'd only just started learning everyone's names. Mariah kept her head down, but the silence around her felt different now. Sharper, more fragile. She began staying later at work, not because anyone asked her to, but because she couldn't leave the numbers alone. She noticed gaps, missing orders, duplicate invoices, irregular shipping routes. On their own, they didn't scream trouble, but together they whispered of something unraveling. Still, no one listened. In meetings, when Mariah tried to bring up her concerns, Neil would give her a polite nod and pivot the conversation. "We'll circle back to that," he'd say, flipping to the next slide. Once, she stayed after to speak to him directly. She held a printed report in her hands, color-coded, detailed, methodical. She'd spent hours on it. Neil barely glanced at it. "I appreciate your thoroughness, Mariah," he said, tapping his pen against the table. "But I think we're overcomplicating things. These fluctuations are normal." "Procurement's on it." She opened her mouth to reply, but stopped. His tone wasn't unkind, but it was final. That night, she walked home slower than usual. It had started to rain, and she didn't open her umbrella. She let the water hit her face, soaking her coat, her shoes, her hair. Felt grounding, like something real when everything else felt slippery and just out of reach. At home, she sat in the dark for a long time, the spreadsheet still glowing on her laptop screen. The plant by the window curled toward her like it was listening. She whispered into the quiet, "It's not just in my head." But she did begin to wonder. Maybe she was seeing patterns where there were none. Maybe she was too cautious, too detailed, too quiet to be taken seriously. It wasn't the first time she'd felt invisible. In school, teachers often forgot she was in class until she turned in perfect assignments. In college, she was the one who made group projects work behind the scenes while others took credit. Even in her own family, at gatherings, her voice was the one talked over. When her father passed away 5 years ago, She'd handled everything, the funeral, arrangements, the estate, the paperwork. Her siblings flew in, grieved loudly, and flew out. No. One asked how she was holding up. She didn't cry then. Not even once. Not until weeks later, when she found one of his old hats in the back of a closet and sat on the floor with it clutched to her chest, rocking back and forth like a child. Grief had taught her that silence can be both armor and prison. At work, the stress began to shift the air. People were on edge, more curt, more distracted. One afternoon, she heard two coworkers, Jake and Leslie, talking near the vending machine. Like she's always watching, Jake said, chuckling. Creeps me out a little, to be honest. She's harmless, Leslie replied. Just one of those background people. Wallpaper. Mariah had turned the corner just in time to hear it. She didn't stop walking, didn't flinch. But that night, when she got home, she didn't play her usual record. She sat in the kitchen with the lights off, letting the quiet fill the room until it felt heavy on her chest. She knew who she was. She knew she was careful, reliable, thoughtful. But words like wallpaper don't just bounce off. They settle into your skin and some part of you starts to believe them. Then came the day she found the error. It was late, almost 7, and the office had mostly emptied out. Mariah was cross-checking the Q3 vendor performance logs against shipment invoices. She wasn't even supposed to be looking at them. It was technically under procurement's umbrella now, but something hadn't added up in the figures from earlier. And there it was, a vendor invoice duplicated across 2 months, with different totals. Payment authorized for a shipment that never arrived. Another one marked urgent and routed through a secondary carrier that charged nearly double. One mistake is human. 2 is concerning. A dozen? That's something else. Mariah sat back in her chair, heart suddenly thudding in her chest. She opened more files, tracing the patterns. The deeper she looked, the worse it became. This wasn't a glitch. Someone was manipulating the data. She printed the reports, flagged the discrepancies, and highlighted key notes in yellow. Her hands trembled as she stapled the pages together. Not out of fear exactly, but something close. A strange mix of adrenaline and the ache of being right about something no one wanted to hear. She sent the report to Neil that night. Clear subject line. Simple language. Everything. Documented. He didn't respond. 2 days passed. On the 3rd day, she was called into HR. They said it was a routine performance review. Mariah sat across from a woman in a navy blazer who smiled too much and used phrases like perception of collaboration and team cohesion metrics. It wasn't a review. It was a warning. Neil was concerned about her attitude. He'd noted that she was creating unnecessary alarm and struggling to adapt to new workflows. Mariah left the room with her hands cold and her throat tight. She didn't speak on the elevator ride down. She didn't go back to her desk. She walked out of the building, down the block, and sat on a bench near the bus stop even though she didn't take the bus. Her chest hurt. Not from panic, but something deeper. A betrayal she couldn't explain. She had done everything right. She had been careful, quiet, respectful, and still they treated her like the problem. That night, for the first time in months, she cried. Not the silent kind she was used to, not the polite tears that slipped down in the dark. She sobbed, bent over at the waist, arms wrapped around her ribs like she could hold herself. Together, came out in waves, grief, anger, exhaustion, all the time she had swallowed her voice just to keep peace. The next morning, she sat at her desk as if nothing had happened. But something had. Something inside her had shifted. Not loudly, not all at once, but like a seed cracking open, underground. The kind of change that doesn't scream. The kind that roots itself quietly and begins to grow. It was a Tuesday morning, gray and quiet. The kind where the sky looked like a held breath and the air felt still, as if the world itself was waiting for something to happen. Maria sat at her desk, her fingers hovering over her keyboard, but not moving. She hadn't typed a single thing in. 20 minutes. The report on her screen blurred in front of her, rows of numbers she could recite by heart, and still she couldn't look at them anymore. The building around her buzzed with normalcy. Phones ringing, footsteps echoing down hallways, conversations punctuated by forced laughter. No one knew what she knew. No one saw what she saw. Or maybe they just chose not to. That possibility hurt more than the silence. The report she'd sent to Neil had disappeared into a void.
No acknowledgement.
No questions. And after that meeting in HR, she knew what was being built around her. A case. Quiet, careful, and cold. They were making her the liability. Mariah sat back and closed her eyes. Her hands were cold. Her mouth dry. She heard the clicking of keyboards nearby, the soft whir of the printer, someone opening a granola bar behind her. Life going on, as though truth didn't matter. She could stay quiet. She knew how. She could let it go, let the fraud wind itself into the system. Let them bury her slowly in write-ups and collaboration reviews, until she either broke or left, where she could speak louder. Her throat tightened at the thought. She wasn't built for confrontation. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't call attention to herself. That wasn't how she'd survived. Not at work. Not in life. She had survived by being invisible. But something inside her had cracked open, and what was spilling out wasn't anger exactly. Was something deeper. A need. A refusal. A kind of quiet truth that didn't want to stay buried anymore. She opened a new document. Her fingers began to type. Not a report this time, but a statement. Clear, detailed, but written like a story. She wrote what she'd found. The patterns. The names. The dates. The approvals. She included screenshots, attachments, linked spreadsheets, internal policy violations, even vendor contract terms. And then, at the bottom, she wrote a simple paragraph in plain language. This is not a mistake. This is not miscommunication. This is deliberate manipulation of procurement data and misallocation of company funds. I am reporting it because it is unethical, and because I believe the integrity of this company and the people who work here deserve better. She read it twice, then saved the document. Her chest ached. Her hands shook. But she didn't stop. She opened the internal whistleblower portal, the one buried 3 links deep on the company intranet. She uploaded her report, clicked submit. It felt like jumping off a cliff with her eyes closed. Then she stood up, not to leave but to walk. She walked past her team, past the cubicles, past Neil's glass office where he sat leaned back in his chair, talking on the phone and spinning a pen between his fingers. She knocked once. He looked up, surprised. Mariah, he said, covering the mouthpiece. Is this urgent? Yes, she said, her voice even. It is. He raised his eyebrows but gestured for her to come in. She closed the door behind her. The room was quiet but humming with tension. Neil looked at her, his expression guarded now, no longer casual. I've submitted a formal report, she said, through the internal ethics channel. It includes everything I found in procurement: duplicate invoices, falsified shipment data, routing, irregularities. There's enough evidence to launch an external audit. There was a pause. Then Neil leaned forward, slow and careful, setting his phone down. Mariah, he said, his tone suddenly lower. You need to understand how these things work. Not everything is as black and white as you might think. It's not a gray area, she said softly. And I'm not asking for your understanding. I'm informing you. His eyes narrowed just slightly. You're putting yourself at risk. I already was, she said. I just decided to stop pretending I wasn't. He leaned back again, his mouth tightening, but he didn't speak. Mariah didn't either. The silence filled the room, but for once, it didn't make her small. She left his office without waiting for a reply. Later that day, the ripple began. She got a call from someone in the compliance department, someone she'd never met before, who asked for a confidential conversation. Then, another from legal. Then, suddenly, the office wasn't so quiet anymore. People noticed. By Thursday, whispers had shifted. Not the cruel, dismissive kind, but curious ones. People were reading between the lines. Neil had canceled 2 meetings and disappeared behind closed doors with executives. There was talk of investigations, of external review. No one said Mariah's name, not out loud, but they looked at her differently. Some avoided her, as others nodded subtly in passing. Janet from payroll left a cup of tea on her desk without a word. She drank it slowly, holding the warmth in her hands like a small mercy. But even as things churned around her, she felt something in her own body she hadn't felt in years. Stillness. Not numbness. Not resignation. But a kind of peace that only comes when you stop hiding from yourself. She walked home in the rain again that night, but it felt different. She held her head higher. Her feet didn't drag. She bought a bunch of tulips from the old vendor on the corner. Just because she could. At home, she placed them in a chipped ceramic vase by the window, next to the pothose plant. The plant had grown a new leaf. She touched its soft green curve and whispered, "We did it." Not because the storm was over. Not because the company would suddenly change. But because for the first time in a long time she had spoken, not in a whisper, not through someone else, but in her own voice. And it had been heard. The audit took weeks. Investigators came and went in sharp suits and quiet voices, carrying briefcases and asking for files. There were interviews, document requests, data pulls that went deep into procurement. Records. People walked on eggshells. Tension clung to the air like static. The office changed, first with whispers, then with silence. Neil was placed on administrative leave. That part wasn't announced formally, but the absence spoke loud enough. His nameplate was gone from the door. His office, once filled with smooth talk and safe-smelling cologne, now sat dim and closed. Mariah didn't gloat. She didn't celebrate. She didn't even feel relief right away. What she felt was tired. A bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of sleep could touch. Her body moved slower. Her thoughts quieter. Not numb, just quieter. Like something inside her had finally unclenched after being held too tight for too long. The HR woman in the navy blazer called her in again. This time there was no talk of team cohesion.
No passive reprimands.
Just a short, awkward acknowledgement of her report and the ongoing investigation. Mariah listened, nodded. She didn't need their approval anymore. She hadn't done it for recognition. Still, walking out of that room, she felt something shift. An invisible weight lifting, not completely gone, but not pressing as hard either. People at work started treating her differently. Some still kept their distance, unsure what to say. Others softened around her. A few even apologized, not directly but in small ways. Leslie brought her a muffin one morning without making eye contact. Jake asked her about a vendor invoice and listened closely when she answered. Janet from payroll, the one who'd left the tea, invited her to lunch. It wasn't dramatic. No grand apologies. Just small human offerings. And Mariah accepted them. Slowly, carefully, like stepping onto new ground. She began to notice things she hadn't before. How the office plants leaned toward the windows. How the temp at reception always hummed when she filed mail. How the quiet ones in meetings often carried the sharpest insights. She had always seen these things in some way, but now, she allowed herself to feel their texture, their meaning, like noticing her own reflection for the first time and really looking. Her own voice, once buried beneath caution, had a new sound in her ears. It still startled her, sometimes to speak and be heard, to take up space. But she no longer apologized for it. She no longer shrank. At home, life moved gently. She played her records more. She cooked slow meals. She sat by the window in the evenings with a book, letting the noise of the day fall away. The tulips had wilted, but she dried them, pressing their petals between the pages of a journal she hadn't touched in years. Some nights she wrote again. Nothing formal, just thoughts, memories, feelings she hadn't known needed air. Her siblings called more often, not to lean on her but to check in. Her younger brother even said once, "I don't think I've told you enough how strong you are." She didn't know what to say back, but something softened in her chest, and that was enough. There were still hard days. Days where doubt crept in, when she wondered if she had made herself a target, if she'd changed her future in ways she couldn't yet see. Sometimes she replayed Neil's face in her mind, the way he'd said, "You're putting yourself at risk," and she wondered what might have happened if she'd stayed silent. But those moments passed more quickly now. Not because she forced them to, but because she no longer feared them. They came, they stayed a while, and they moved on. Healing, she learned, wasn't a moment. It was a slow unfolding. Spring came early that year. The tree outside her apartment bloomed in sudden pinks and whites. The city began to shed its gray. On a Saturday morning, Mariah went for a walk, letting the sun fall warm on her face. She bought herself a fresh bouquet, wildflowers this time, loose and bright. She smiled as she carried them home. She placed them by the window, next to the pothose and the dried tulip petals. Looking at them, she realized something she hadn't named until now. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living with herself, with her truth, her courage, her quiet strength. And it was enough. It had always been enough. She just hadn't seen it. Now she did. Mariah stayed with the company for a while after the audit concluded. Not because she felt she owed them anything, but because she wasn't done with the work, not just the job itself, but her place within it. Things shifted around her slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. Procedures were rewritten. A new head of compliance was brought in. The whispers faded. And in the silence that remained, she found a strange kind of peace. She was offered a promotion a few months later. A leadership role, not flashy, but meaningful. She would oversee ethical practices in vendor relations, help rebuild the very processes that had once been manipulated. She said yes, not for status or recognition, but because it allowed her to shape something better, more honest. Felt right. She led her small team differently. She listened more than she spoke. She asked questions others might have rushed past. She noticed when someone in the room looked uncertain, and she gave them space to speak. Her voice, once so hesitant, had become something solid, not loud, but steady. People trusted her. And more than that, she trusted herself. Outside of work, life softened too. She reconnected with her college friend Tessa, someone she hadn't spoken to in years, not out of bitterness, but out of a quiet drifting apart. They met for coffee on a windy afternoon, and the conversation flowed as if no time had passed. They laughed, reminisced, shared stories of becoming, of mistakes and slow awakenings. They made plans to meet again, and this time, they did. Mariah also joined a local community garden. It was something she'd always thought about but never made time for. She liked the rhythm of it, the slow digging, the patience, the growth. She found calm in the soil, in the silence between people working side by side. One older woman, Ruth, took a liking to her and offered advice without pretense. "Tomatoes don't care how stressed you are," she said once. "They just need sun and water. You give them that, they give you something back." Mariah smiled at that, stayed with her. Some days, she still remembered the moment she'd clicked submit on that whistleblower report. Not as a trauma, but as a turning point. Not the kind you mark with celebration, but with quiet knowing. It had been the beginning of something, not just for the company, but for her. Doorway she had walked through alone, uncertain, trembling, but upright. She hadn't crumbled. She hadn't disappeared. And even though things hadn't been perfect since then, she still had hard days, self-doubt, moments of retreat. There was a steadiness in her now that hadn't been there before. Rootedness. She began journaling again in earnest. Not every day, not always neatly, but enough to hear herself clearly. She wrote about integrity, not as a rule but as a rhythm. About dignity, not as pride but as presence. The quiet strength of standing in one's truth without needing it to be loud. One entry, she simply wrote, "Dignity is not something they give you. It's something you carry, even when no one sees it." That line stayed with her. She didn't write it to inspire anyone. She wrote it to remember, because for so long, she had mistaken being unnoticed for being unworthy. Now she understood. Her worth was never up for debate. It had always been there, soft, steady, waiting for her to turn toward it. One Sunday morning, as the sun poured through her window and touched the leaves of her pothose plant, now much fuller, trailing down the shelf in gentle loops, Mariah made herself a cup of tea and stood at the glass, watching the city stir awake. A child's laugh echoed from the park across the street. Somewhere, someone was playing piano, faint and warm. She stood there for a long while, not thinking, not planning, just being. Felt like a small miracle, this moment, not because it was grand or unusual, but because it was hers, fully, freely, and without apology. She had walked through fire, not a blaze for the world to see, but a slow, quiet burn that only she had felt. And she had emerged not with ashes, but with roots, with clarity, with the kind of strength that doesn't seek attention, but cannot be shaken. Mariah turned from the window and smiled, not at anyone, but from a place inside herself that had been waiting for this, for her. She picked up her mug, took a sip of tea, and let the warmth settle in her chest. Outside, the city kept moving, but inside her, there was stillness, truth, and the quiet, steady heartbeat of someone who had finally come home to herself. And that was enough.